Well, hello, hello. Hello, everyone. It's been a couple of weeks since we've done a live from my Facebook group. It's Krista Watson here from Krista Quilts, and I'm excited to chat with you guys. So, as you guys are jumping on, you know the drill. Say hi. Let me know if you can hear me. Tell me where you're watching or listening from today. I am back home in Las Vegas. We just returned from a week-long beach vacation, which was sorely needed. I'm a little bit tan. I'm wearing the glasses today because I didn't feel like putting on my contacts. Had a nice fresh shower this morning. I've been working on some quilting and some work, and it's great to be back. So I see everyone jumping on. We have a lot to talk about today. We are going to continue to bust those quilting myths. So if you guys are on and you can see me, I've got my phone here so I can catch all the comments. I'm talking on my computer. I see people starting to jump on, making sure all the technology is working. So if you can see me and if you can hear me, just give me a little thumbs up or a like, say hi real quick. I'm waiting for my phone to come up. I always have my phone with me, and I don't see it in my group yet, so I know sometimes there's a little bit of a lag, but I'm just going to make sure. So, okay, Michelle's here, at least for a little bit. Nice to see you. Nice to see everybody jumping on. And you guys, I do save these for later, so if you're watching later, welcome. If you're watching live and you want to go back and rewatch it, you're welcome to do that at any time. It will also be posted on YouTube. I have been doing a little bit more on YouTube, so trying to catch up with everyone where they're at. So can you guys see me okay? Can you hear me? Oh, hi Milo. Good to see you. And Barb and Michelle. Everybody's starting to jump on. And Lena, I know she's around here too. So anyway, welcome. It's so great to see you guys. So today we are going to talk about busting some quilting myths. 2 weeks ago, before I went on vacation, I put a question out to you guys to tell me your biggest myths that you want to know about. We can talk honestly about them. And we only got through one page, maybe about a page and a half of questions 2 weeks ago. So today I'm here to finish. I'll try to go through them very quickly, and we will keep this at just under an hour, so it's not too crazy. But again, if you jump in during the middle or later, you can always go back and rewatch the questions. I see people jumping on. Oh, good. Michelle's getting a jump start on her bling. So let me start off and just talk about that very briefly. Even though these are evergreen content, which means you can go back and you can always learn later on, it is Tuesday, July 21st when I'm recording this. I think of this as just a live chat, ask me anything. And we just started our bling quilt along. It's a little bit reflective there, but you can see the quilt, the black version, is hanging up behind me right here. So those of you that want to grab a copy of my bling pattern, you can do that and join the quilt along. I'll probably do like a roundup post next week, and we can talk a little bit more about bling. So those of you that want to make the quilt, start working on it, think about your questions, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in depth. But today I have so many questions to get through, I don't have a lot of time to talk about it, other than you can get the pattern, either the PDF on Etsy, or you can get the printed pattern right here at shop.kristaquilts.com. And we just started the quilt along. The quilt along itself is free. You just need the pattern, and we're going to go over the next 5 weeks and make the entire quilt. So we'll talk more about this quilt on future live Ask Me Anythings here on our chat. And so that way, if you guys have questions, I can give extra bonus tips and things like that. So the other thing I want to talk about is 2 weeks ago, I did a couple giveaways of my books, and today one person is going to win a copy of Machine Quilting with Style. I have one extra bonus copy, and so I've got questions written down on paper. These were questions that people had submitted previously, and so one of the people that wrote a question is going to win a copy of that book. So yay, I like to give things away. Oh good, welcome back. We had a great time. We were at the beach. Hi Sue, there in North Carolina, and I have not been really out of the city since February when I went to QuiltCon, and I have been home for months on end, and I really needed to get out, so it was great to get out. So okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I see a bunch of people jumping on. I'm so glad you guys are here. We will continue to do these lives every Tuesday at 3 p.m. and again, you can always come back and watch them later on. So let's jump right into the questions, shall we? And as I'm discussing these questions, just pretty much about quilting tips and tricks, If you guys have questions or want to know more, go ahead and leave me a comment. I can see your comments coming through and I will be happy to answer them. And Pam's here from Sioux Falls. Yay, good. You guys, the reason I do these weekly chats is number one, because I want to stay connected with you guys. But number two, I honestly miss teaching. There's something about me. I really need to teach. I need to talk. I need to interact with you guys. And so this gives me a chance to teach and interact and kind of feel like we have a little class going on. So we're going to jump off with the questions. I look like a news anchor. I'm kind of reading my paper here, but I'll also try to keep on eye contact with you guys and have fun. So I have to start off with Doris, her question first of all. I give her bonus points because I think this is a great question. How's the pool coming? So those of you that don't know, we decided to put a pool in our backyard in Vegas because it's super hot here. All of our friends and neighbors have one. We were feeling a little, like we were missing out. Just kidding. I've always enjoyed swimming in Las Vegas. So we're building a pool. It's probably going to take about 3 months. And so it's going to be done just in time for the end of summer. But we can use it year round. And we're getting a jacuzzi too. So we are waiting right now for the gas company to come over because we have this little tiny side yard that the little bobcat has to get into our backyard and dig the hole for our pool. And the the gas meter is actually blocking our yard. So we're waiting on the gas company to come over and remove the meter so that they can get in there and start digging. The good thing about that is they don't have to break down any walls and we don't have to pay anything for the company to come out and remove it. The bad thing about it is we are going to be without gas for about 4 or 5 days while they dig the hole in the ground. So whenever that starts, that means we won't have any hot water, we won't be able to use the oven or the stove, so it's going to be takeout and cold showers or maybe showering at the neighbor's house if they let us. So anyway, we're kind of excited. We want to get that over and done with, and then they can actually get to the building of the pool. I wrote about it on my blog a little while ago, and we're kind of excited about it. So that's kind of personal news there. Okay, so let's get into the questions. So first of all, Jessica wants to know, what type of needles do you use for hand binding? And we had an earlier question, I'll put them together, about what kind of needles do I use for sewing, for my sewing machine. So when I'm using my sewing machine, you want to match the needle to the size of the thread, and I like to use size 80 needles with size 50 thread, and that's pretty much all I use. When it comes to hand sewing or hand binding, I just like to use any needle that's kind of stiff and is not going to bend or break, and it has a big enough eye that I can thread it. On last week's discussion, I think we talked about this too, and a couple people recommended like bohine needles, clover needles, anything that's a good brand. With anything, I would just say try a couple different needles and see what you like. I like to represent and be brand ambassadors for a lot of products that I use. I haven't had a partnership with a needle company yet, and if that ever happens, then I would probably know a lot more. For now, I just kind of use whatever needle I can find. Not a great answer, but it's honest. Okay, Mary wants to know, she was asking about what needle size you use with a 40 weight cotton. So those of you that are not as familiar with thread, your basic middle weight is called a 50 weight, and then the larger the number, the thinner the thread. So example, if you're using a 60 weight thread, that's going to be thinner than a 50 weight. If you use a 40 weight thread, that's going to be thicker. And so again, you want the needle to match the size of the thread. So I use 50 weight Aurifil thread with a size 80-12 needle. If I were using a 40 weight, as Jessica's asking, then I would use like a size 90 needle. And so you can try out different combinations, but just think 50 weight thread, 80-12 needle, and you're good to go. Lori had a couple great questions. She wants to know, is it really okay to iron open the seams? So on my blog post from yesterday, you just go to kristaquilts.com. I talk about the bling quilt, and I talk about pressing seams open. It is absolutely okay to iron your seams open. You just want to use a shorter stitch length, and the nice thing about the shorter stitch length is then you don't actually see the thread poking through your seams, so that's another reason to do it. Lori also wants to know, does too much quilting make a quilt stiffer? No, it doesn't. If you guys see my quilts, you know that I really love putting lots of quilting into my quilts, and it's not the quilting that makes your thread or your quilt stiff, it's the materials you're using. So if you're using breathable cotton and breathable cotton thread, breathable cotton fabric, and a natural fiber batting like cotton or like a wool, you're going to get breathability in your quilt, and it's not going to stiffen up. It's when you put the synthetics in your quilt, like the polyesters and the nylons and the rayons, that's what's actually making your quilt stiff, because they're not flexible and breathable, because they're not a natural fiber. So just remember natural fiber, and you can have a nice breathable quilt. Nancy wants to know, do I always use the same color thread in the spool and bobbin, or do I sometimes use different colors depending on the backing? 99% of the time, I'm going to use the same color thread in the top and the bobbin when I'm piecing and when I'm machine quilting, because then I'm not going to get little pokies. Pokies are those little dots that show up. Let's say if you're quilting or sewing with black thread in your top and then white thread in the bobbin, no matter how good your tension is, you're going to get little dots of black or white because it's just going to show up on the other side. So do yourself a favor, make it easy, use a same color or a similar color in top and bobbin, and that'll help prevent those little pokies. So that's really good. And I love that Michelle here is working on her bling pieces. You know, if you guys want to sew while you're listening, or, you know, fold some laundry or something like that, you know, that's awesome. Be efficient. I think that's really, really cool. And Michelle says she needed a break from mask making. You're doing amazing making all those masks, but yes, sometimes we need to take a break and sew some other fun stuff. Oh yeah, Amy, I read your question last week. Yes, I did. Yay, but that's okay. I'm glad you're here today as well. We'll switch to a live question and I'll go back and forth if you guys want to ask more questions. Nancy says, how do you keep your cut fabrics and supplies for a project organized while you're working on the project? Well, I have a nice large sewing room and I use my design wall right here. So if I'm working on a project, a lot of times the pieces will be on the design wall. If I have to work on multiple projects, I like to put them either in Ziploc baggies or I have different drawers. You can't really see it, but if you kind of peek over there a little bit, those are wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling cabinets that store all of my projects and my supplies. And so I have different drawers allocated to different projects. But mostly, this is something that kind of is a little bit out there. I don't really have a lot of UFOs because I'm always working on quilts for books, magazines, patterns, and things like that. I prefer to work on one quilt at a time from start to finish. I know that's kind of sacrilege when it comes to quilting, but it kind of messes with my brain if I've got a million projects going on. So, you know, I like to do one quilt at a time, maybe 2 quilts, 3 at the most, and that's about all I can handle. So I normally like to just get it done, move on to the next project and keep going. But I know I'm not the norm and that's totally fine. So you can work on as many projects as you want to. Barb wants to know, okay, she says, share your Bernina cover. Yes, I will grab this over here and I want to share it with you. I'll give a friend a little plug. So this was actually made for my grid work fabric, and my friend Annie Unrein made that for me. So by Annie, for those of you that don't know, she makes amazing bags and sewing machine project covers and patterns, and every season she always uses some of my fabrics on her patterns. Sometimes they're on the cover, sometimes I show them at Quilt Market, and as a little thank you every now and then she lets me keep a few of the little pieces. So she actually made this for me because I don't do 3D sewing, but isn't that just cute? It's got little like pockets on the side. I can't remember what it's called. It's just her sewing machine cover, and you can get the pattern at by Annie, and it's got like his little zipper to hold things. And so I put it on my machine because I was gone for a week. You can see my machine right over there. So yeah, I'm glad you noticed that. It was my fabric and Annie's pattern with it. Okay, Janice wants to know, this is my friend Janice in Nebraska. This is a great question. Have I ever sewn with clear thread? Yes. I don't love it. I hate to say it. She said, if so, which brand do you like the best? I've heard some of them can turn yellow over the years. Yes, I will recommend the one and only brand that I use is Aurifil. I'm an Aurifil girl, and so I use all of their threads for everything. If I am forced to use nylon thread, invisible thread, I hate to say it, but I will use the Aurifil because that's, to me, has been the best quality of the invisible thread. The trick to keep it from not like unwinding all over the place and stretching out of shape is to get what's called a thread sock. It's like a little plastic fishnet looking thing that you put over your thread. It's called a thread sock, and it helps the nylon or invisible or monopoly or whatever it's made out of. It helps the invisible thread come off better. However, I just don't love it. I just love cotton thread. And so the only time I will ever actually use invisible is in the bobbin. If for some reason I can't, if my top and my bobbin are really, really wildly different colors, then I will use an invisible in the bobbin, but not in the top. And I will only fill up my bobbin halfway, and I will fill it up on a slower speed. So when in doubt, if you want to use invisible, or a fill is the best. But for me personally, I just use cotton thread because it just works out better. But good question. Okay. Oh, Denise, this is an interesting question. She wants to know, Denise Boysel, if I'm saying your name right. Hopefully, if I'm massacring your name, guys, you have my permission to butcher my name as well. So, how do I schedule my day when you start in the quilt cave, or what'd you say? Oh, when do you start quilting in the quilt cave, and when do you generally stop for the day? Okay, here's another answer. I'm going to be honest with you guys. I work all the time because quilting is my hobby as well as my business. I love it. And my family works from home. And of course, because of the virus right now, you know, my daughter's the only one home living right now. She's in school. I mean, she's in summer now, but she was doing homeschool online. My husband works with me at home. I work at home. And so we're just here all the time. So I get up in the morning, have my breakfast, try to straighten up the house a little bit, and I get started working right away. I normally check my emails in the morning because I'm up before anyone else, and I can do that quietly. I don't touch the sewing machine until anyone's up because I'm in a big upstairs loft area, and it kind of rattles a little bit when I sew, and so it can be a little bit noisy, so I don't do that till anyone wakes up. But I normally just take care of whatever I have to do for the day. I do have a flexible schedule. I can stop for lunch. You know, I can hang out with the family. If we need to do something or take care of something during the day, we can do that. We normally have dinner together as a family. That's very important to us. And then sometimes I'll sew again in the evening. So pretty much if I'm not exercising or swimming or relaxing with the family, I'm working because I just love it so much. So I try to cut back on some of my hours, but you know, it's just fun when you got a deadline and you got things to do. So yeah, I'm kind of a workaholic, but it works really well. Pam wants to know, is it best to press the binding in half before sewing it to the quilt top? I've read that the pressed in crease is not where the final folds ends up. What do I think about this? I was taught how to do binding one way, and I do it for all my bindings. It's called a double fold, I think called a straight grain French fold, double fold binding, where you just cut straight of grain strips and you cut them in half, or you cut your strips out, then you fold them in, along the wrong sides once, then you sew it on your quilt, and then you flip it over so that your quilt is encased with 2 layers of binding on the front and 2 layers of binding on the back. And yes, I do press it. I press the seams open when I'm attaching my binding, and once the binding is actually on the quilt, I press the binding around the quilt before I clip it in place, and so that really helps. So I haven't had any issues with pressing. Kind of related to that, we had the same question this week and last week about bias binding, straight grain binding, and the only time I will use bias binding, where it's cut on the diagonal, is if I am putting a binding on a quilt that has curves. If I'm just using a quilt, 99% of my quilts have straight corners, I'm just going to use a straight grain binding, and I like to cut my strips out at 2 inches because that ends up finishing a nice perfect 1/4 inch on both sides. When I started quilting, I used 2 1/4 inch strips, and got a little flyaway hairs here. I used 2 1/4 inch strips when I started, and the binding on one side would be a little bit wider, and I didn't like that, so I started cutting out 2 inch strips, and that works a lot better. But you can use leftover jelly roll strips too, and either trim them down or use them as is for your binding. So I think that's really great. Oh, Mary says she loves Annie's patterns. Yeah, they're great. I try to snag something that she makes out of my fabric at least once or twice a year. Oh, Amy wants to know, do you have a good source for buying Aurifil other than my boxes, of course? Yes, we actually, most of you guys know, I sell my own products at shop.kristaquilts.com. My husband runs another site independently of what I do, and it's called the Precut Store. It's actually a little shop on Amazon that my husband takes care of, where we actually sell everything. We sell, well, not everything. We sell pre-cuts, but we sell like all the pre-cuts, all the Aurifil threads. And so if you just go to Amazon and just search Aurifil thread, most likely it's us. Or if you just go to theprecutstore.com, you can find everything we have there. We don't keep it here at the home. We actually store everything in Amazon's fulfillment warehouses. So I can't tell you like what we have in stock, but you can just go there and check it out. Anyway, that's what my husband does. He runs the Precut Store, and I run kristaquilts.com, and between the two of us it works well. So check out the Precut Store on Amazon, and you can pretty much get just about any color of spool by the color. For me personally, I sell my collections of Aurifil thread, which I'm actually out of, and I'm getting more. More should be arriving in the next few days. I have 3 Aurifil thread collections, so I'll be talking about those when I get them back in stock. They ran out of stock, and I've kind of been out of them for a while, so I'm waiting for them to come back. But okay, good question. Oh, thank you, Lisa. I'm glad you appreciate the prices. You know, I do go off on a tangent here. I am a fabric designer and a pattern designer, and of course, I do recommend for you guys to check your local shops and your favorite like online quilt shops because I want to support them. But this is my business, and so in addition to designing the fabrics and stuff, I do sell them directly because I know not everybody has a local quilt shop they can get to, or maybe they can't find one in their area. And so that's kind of why I do the online thing, is to allow people to buy directly from me. But of course, my preference is always to go to your quilt shop first. And then if you can't find it, then you can come to me. And between the two of us, we got you covered. All right, moving on to more questions. Kathy, this was great. Kathy actually asked a question about t-shirt quilts, and then Cindy answered it for her because I have never actually made a t-shirt quilt. But Kathy wants to know what's a good stabilizer for them, and Cindy says a non-woven fusible stabilizer like Pellon. So those of you that are interested in t-shirt quilts, you can try that out. Peggy also had a question about t-shirt quilts. She's doing her first. So Peggy, please share pictures of your t-shirt quilt and share any tips and tricks as you're making it. I know everybody wants to do that. She's doing her first one and using her son's, a friend's son's team t-shirts over the years. Some of his shirts are jersey material. Would you incorporate them in the quilt? And what, if anything, special would you do to make it a memorable gift? So what I would do anytime you're using any kind of t-shirt material or anything that is not like regular cotton, definitely put some stabilizer on it and then cut out the most memorable parts. What I would probably try to do to make it more interesting is I would try to make it more of like a puzzle. So instead of cutting out a bunch of squares of t-shirt material that are all the same size, the parts on the shirt are all going to be different sizes. So I would cut out like squares and rectangles of different sizes and then put them up on your design wall and then maybe surround them with other colorful fabrics from your stash that match. And I think that would be really cool. And a really memorable way to do it is if you could get maybe some people to sign a label or put some messages. Another fun thing you can do is you can incorporate messages into the quilt. You can either write them with a fabric marker, you can embroider them, or what I've even done is I've done free motion quilting where I've quilted hidden messages in a quilt. You can say like, congratulations, or we're all thinking of you, or whatever you want to do. You can actually do that in the free motion quilting, and it kind of makes it a fun kind of hide and seek to look for that. So great questions on t-shirt quilts. And again, if those of you have done t-shirt quilts, if you guys want to share tips with each other, I think that's amazing also. Michelle says, make sure to get a pressing cloth before you start ironing it to the interfacing and the t-shirt. Thank you, Michelle. That's a very good tip. Norma wants to know, do I always stitch in the ditch before free motion quilting? And the answer is no. I basically quilt 3 different ways. Number 1, the first easiest way is I will do an all over walking foot design. And when I'm doing an all over walking foot design, I will stitch in the ditch on some of the major seam lines, maybe to form a grid. It's what I call anchor quilting. So for example, this quilt here, I would stitch in the ditch in between each of the blocks so it would look like I have a bunch of squares all the way, and then I would add some more quilting. So the first way I quilt is all over walking foot quilting, either straight lines or wavy lines or decorative stitches. The second way I would quilt would be an all over free motion design, let's say a stipple or a swirl or something like that. In that case, on this quilt, I would start on one side and I would start in one block and I would free motion meander like up and down and over and back all the way. And in that case, I would not do any stitching in the ditch because I'm working my way from one edge to the other across the quilt. The third way that I quilt, I call custom quilting, where I combine free motion and walking foot. And in that case, I do all of the walking foot quilting first, then I fill in the extra areas with free motion. When I'm doing the custom quilting, I will also anchor quilt, in which case I will stitch some of the ditches that are gonna stay like the stitching I do, I never take it out. It's not basting, it's actual stabilizing stitching, but I never stitch all of the ditches. I just do the major seam lines, because anytime you stitch in the ditch or near the ditch, you're gonna stabilize that area that you stitched, and then I can go back and fill in with free motion quilting in bigger areas. But any stabilizing stitching that you've done in the ditch is gonna hold that area of the quilt, and it's not gonna shift or go anywhere. So that's a great question. Diane wants to know, cutting paper with fabric scissors makes them dull, fact or fiction? Well, what I try to do is I try to have fabric scissors and I try to have paper scissors, and that goes with rotary cutters too. I try to have a rotary cutter that I just use for cutting paper and a rotary cutter that I just use for cutting fabric. I don't do a lot of paper piecing, but sometimes I do, and in that case I'll use an older, like more dull rotary cutter when I'm cutting out like paper pieces. What you can do if your scissors are getting dull is you can actually buy scissor sharpeners, and I know some quilt shows actually have scissor sharpening service where you can take them in. But for the most part, I don't really buy super expensive scissors, so if they get dull after a while, I can just replace them, and it's not a big deal. I honestly don't use scissors very much because most of my quilting is just with quilting rather than like clothing cutting, and so I use a rotary cutter. I actually use a rotary cutter when I cut out fabrics for clothing too, so it's very rare that I actually use scissors. Speaking of scissors, somebody else had a question on here. I can't remember who asked it, but they wanted to know, do I ever cut batting with scissors? And I don't, because it's very difficult to cut batting with regular scissors. However, here's my one of my visual aids for today. Check out these guys. These are called batting shears. I think these are from Handy Quilter. I think Fomore has some too. Anyway, I think these are probably about 30 or 40 bucks, so they're pretty expensive. These are called batting shears, and this is what I use. Once you buy a pair of these, oh my gosh, you will never go back. These are wonderful for cutting batting. So go ahead and invest in a pair of these. I don't sell them myself, and I don't have a brand relationship, but if you can just find these anywhere, like I said, about $30 or $40, any brand will work, but they're really big. The Handy Quilter ones have the purple handles. I've seen them with other color handles as well. These are really wonderful. All right, I'll continue going back to the questions live to make sure I'm catching everybody. Nancy wants to know, what length of stitch do you use? Okay, that's a great question. So when I am piecing, I will use a 2.0 stitch length instead of a 2.5. When I am machine quilting, if I'm doing walking foot quilting, I'm going to turn it up and I'm going to do a 3.0. If I'm doing free motion quilting, I'm actually not setting the stitch length because free motion quilting is determined based on how fast or slow you're stitching. Now, I do have a Bernina, and I do have a Bernina stitch regulator where I can set the stitch length. However, I don't actually use my Bernina stitch regulator. I just free motion quilt with the regular foot. So I'll just kind of repeat that. My default on my machine is 2.5. So I turn it down I shouldn't say thumbs down, I turn it down to piece. I turn it down to 2.0 to piece, and I turn it up to 3.0 when I'm walking foot quilting. So is that clear as mud for you? Hopefully that answers your question. Sue Miller wants to know, is it really necessary to set your seams? No, I think someone also had this question last week, but I'll address it again. Setting your seams is when you have your stitched piece and you put your iron on top of it, and it's supposed to squeeze the fabric together, or it's supposed to squeeze the thread together. And then you can open the piece back up, and you can press to the dark or light or open. Because I press all of my seams open, I'm getting a lot of the hot iron on that thread, and so it's not necessary for me to set my seams when I press them open. But if you want to do it, it's totally fine. To me, it just kind of seems like an extra step that I don't need to do. All right, Karen has a great question. She pre-washes everything, and batiks always bleed. Yes, they do. You guys, I don't really use batiks very much. I don't really have anything, I don't have anything against them, but they do bleed. They are a tighter weave, and what else? And I don't really find as many modern fabrics in batiks, although you can use them in modern quilts. But I haven't really used batiks, but I have worked with them in the past. And anyway, they do bleed a lot. So I highly recommend pre-washing your batiks. She said if there was no pre-washing and the completed quilt is washed with color catchers, how many washes will need to have color catchers? When does the bleeding stop? The bleeding stops when the bleeding stops. So let's back up. If you are going to use batik fabric, I do recommend pre-washing with color catchers, and you're just going to have to wash it and wash it and wash it until the color catchers are not picking up fabric. Same thing for your quilt. Sometimes you might have to wash a quilt 2 or 3 times before it comes out. One thing you have to consider is depending on the soap you're using, the hardness or softness of your water temperature, all of those can affect whether or not your fabrics bleed and your quilts bleed. So for me, I pre-wash all my fabrics except for pre-cuts. I wash my quilts when they're done, and I do use color catchers. And it's okay if you have to use more than one color catcher, and it's okay if you have to wash more than once. That's kind of the name of the game when you're dealing with fabric, but great question. All right, Chris Smits wants to know, do you square up blocks before assembling the quilt top? I actually don't square up my blocks because if I've done the math right, it should turn out right. If you square up your blocks, you're going to end up cutting your pieces smaller. So rather than squaring up blocks, I do a seam test and I make sure that my 1/4 inch seams are accurate. And at each step in the process, I make sure my pieces are accurate before moving on. If you have a mistake in one part of the piece and then it just exacerbates and you add more and more pieces, it's hard to fix that later. Gotta take a quick drink here. But if you'll notice, most of my designs are very big blocky pieces. So like my bling quilt right here, those are very big blocks. And so it's a lot easier to get accurate results with bigger pieces. I like to show off more fabrics and I like to show off my quilting, so I don't use a lot of very tiny fussy piecing. I actually use bigger pieces, and so it's easier to get better seams. But yeah, it just practice. Try to get your seams accurate, try to get your pressing accurate, and all that stuff will help in your final result. However, if that's all said and done and your pieces still are not coming out to the size they should be, you can use the F word. I call fudging. You might say some words while you're sewing as well, but I will fudge my seams if I have to. So let's say my block has come up maybe a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch short, then I will pretend it's the right size. And when I'm putting two pieces together, if one of them's a little bit short, I will line up the seam on the one that's the correct size. So what I mean by that is, like, one side of the seam might be an accurate 1/4 of an inch, but the other part of the seam might only be an 1/8 of an inch. Sometimes I might go back and sew another seam to strengthen it, but any little imperfections, I'll just try to fudge it when I sew them together. And if you can still notice your imperfections, I don't sweat it. By the time you quilt the heck out of it, it's going to be, you're not going to notice it. By the time you wash your quilt, you're not going to notice it. So I call myself a perfectly imperfect quilter, and my quilting is perfectly imperfect, so I try not to sweat it. That was a long answer to your short question, but try to do the best job you can. Don't overthink it, don't stress about it, and just know that the more you quilt, the better you'll get with practice, and it's fun. It's fun to practice. All right, Lena wants to know, I spray base my tops and backing, and then I iron and quilt. Can I pre-baste, meaning spray and store it until ready to quilt it in a day or two, or should I do it the same day? No, it's totally fine. You can spray your top and backing and set those aside, and you can always come back a couple days later and it'll still be fine. You don't have to spray and quilt all in the same day. For those of you that are new or haven't seen, I have a spray basting tutorial on my website and also on my YouTube channel where I show how to assemble the layers after they've been spray basting. So check that out. But yeah, you don't have to spray and quilt all in the same day. The stickiness will hold up after a while, so that's not a problem. Milo wants to know, I just read that batting with polyester will eventually destroy the fabric. Is this true? I honestly don't know if this is true or not. So let's kind of talk about this whole polyester thing. When you're making your quilt, you can absolutely use whatever materials you want. You can use cotton fabric, polyester fabric, linen fabric, flannel fabric, anything you can want. You can mix them, you can match them. It doesn't really matter. It's going to be fine. However, back in the day, when our materials weren't as high quality as they were now, the myth was that polyester materials are stronger than with cotton, and that they will hold up over time, or polyester thread will wear through your cotton. I honestly don't know, because I haven't had a quilt for 100 years. But going back to an earlier answer, I only work with cotton and natural fiber anyway. So if it is true or not that polyester will mess up your quilt, I normally don't use it anyway, so it's not really an issue. I know that's kind of that's a political answer for you. That's, not really answering it. But the reason I don't like polyester batting isn't because it's going to mess up your cotton. The reason I don't like polyester batting is it's very slippery. So if you are machine quilting with polyester batting, there's a higher chance that you are going to get tucks and puckers, because as you're quilting and going along and you're scrunching and smishing your quilt under the machine, that batting is going to slip inside your fabric, inside the quilt, and it's going to cause puckers. Whereas cotton and wool are going to cling to your cotton fabric, and so you're going to have less issues. So in general, I stay away from polyester, but that's just a personal preference. But I'm glad you asked that question. All right, Donna wants to know, if you use polyester thread, is the thread going to eventually tear down your cotton quilt? I don't know, because like I said, the stuff we have now is a higher quality. The other reason I don't like polyester is it's just kind of cheaper. I mean, I know a lot of times we're working on a budget, but I would rather rather save up my money and get good quality Aurifil cotton and get it on sale, because it does go on sale, rather than waste too much money on the inexpensive. So if you stick with the natural fiber, like I mentioned, not only is your quilt going to be softer and cuddlier, it's just a higher quality material because it is man-made, or excuse me, it is natural rather than man-made. So overall, you're going to have better results. It's going to shrink at the same rate. It's just going to be more breathable and stuff like that. I don't know that it'll necessarily wear through if you're using the polyester. Okay, Nancy says, I've been piecing a quilt and now it's time to sew together in blocks. I didn't spray starch before. Would it be a bad idea to do it now? Spray starch is a personal preference. Going back to her question, I do starch my fabric before I cut it. I don't starch my fabric once I've sewn the blocks. And the reason why, it's just user error on my part. If I starch a block that's been finished, I end up starching it out of shape. So if you didn't starch to begin with, don't worry about starching now. Just don't pull on your pieces very much, and iron with a very light hand. And what I mean by that is don't don't smush and stretch your stuff out of shape. Pressing is where you lift the iron up and down. Ironing is where you're pushing it along. So don't iron, just press your seams and don't handle them a lot, and you should be fine. I only started starching my fabric a few years ago, but for the first 20 years of quilting, I didn't starch, and I was fine with it. It just gives me a little more body, and it makes it easier to match up my seams when I use starch. But again, we're talking about like an A versus an A plus effort. So an A is still okay. An A minus and a B is still okay. So these are just things to think about, but don't feel like, oh my gosh, my quilt is ruined because I didn't starch it. Not at all. Start with the basics, do what you're working on now, and then your next quilt, you can think about starching it. And then your next quilt, you can think about adding one or two of these little tips I share with you. But enjoy the process. That's the important thing. Lisa said, oh, you learned that the hard way with some batting I used for wavy line quilting. Oh, scooting happened. Yeah, I share this story sometimes. When I was making my Modern X quilt, those of you, it's actually on sale right now. The pattern is on my website. The paper pattern is on sale right now. It has lots of straight line quilting. I quilted that quilt. I quilted half of that quilt because it was originally going on display, and I used a polyester batting because a very nice friend of mine who is an amazing long arm quilter said, oh, you should try this polyester batting. It's amazing. Well, what I didn't realize at the time, she's a long arm quilter. When you're quilting on a long arm, your batting is held tight the entire time. When you're on a domestic, you're scrunching and smushing. So I had basted the quilt, I started quilting it, did all my anchor quilting, and I was getting puckers, and I was so frustrated. I was ready to cry. This was about 5 years ago. I was ready to give up. I said, you know what? This quilt is going to be seen in public. I have got to redo this. So I unpicked the entire quilting that I had done. I re-basted it with a cotton batting, and I didn't have one pucker at all with all that straight line. So some people do great with polyester. Again, user error. Polyester and I do not get along, so I just stick with cotton or wool, and then I don't have any puckers. So it's the little things, but again, all of these tips I gave you, this is what works according to Krista. Try it out, see what works, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. All right, we have a couple more questions to get through. This is great. I really enjoy the interaction with you guys. Michelle wants to know, this is Michelle C. How often should the machine needle be changed out while doing a project? After piecing, before quilting, as needed. So I actually sell on my website, I don't have them with me right here, but I sell Superior brand needles, and they are made of titanium, and they are fabulous. I think it's like $7 for a pack of needles. There's 5 to 7 in the pack, so maybe they're about $1, maybe a little over $1 each. They are wonderful, and they last a long time. Now, there's the rule of thumb, and then there's the reality. So the rule of thumb says you should change your needle for every 8 hours of sewing. The reality is, who times how much they're sewing? Did I sew for 2 hours today? Did I sew for 10 hours? I don't know. I was just sewing. I was working on it. I wasn't timing myself. So what I do, the reality is, I will change out my needle every time I start a new quilt top. And I try to sew the entire quilt top on one needle. Now, if while I'm sewing, I get a really weird sound, or I get knocking, or my stitches are really out of whack, then something has happened with my needle, and I will change it. At most, I only have to use about maybe 1 or 2 needles for piecing the top. When I'm done with the top, I clean out my machine, I oil it, I delint it, all that kind of stuff, and then I machine quilt. And I normally will go through, again, 1 to 2 needles for quilting. So if I'm doing really good, if everything's working great, it only takes me 2 needles for an entire quilt. If I have issues, then I might go through 4 or 5 needles. But again, the needle is the cheapest thing you can do. So just change out that needle. If you cannot remember the last time you changed it, change your needle. So that's a great question. Oh, Vicki, to wash or not wash your fabric. I don't mind answering this question every time. So according to Krista, this is what I do. I wash fat quarters, and I wash them in a small mesh garment bag so they don't get all shriveled up. I wash anything bigger than fat quarters and anything bigger than a fat quarter. I do not wash pre-cuts because they will shrivel up. When I'm pre-washing my fabric, I wash it on cold water, on delicate, using liquid soap. I actually like the Tide Pods. I don't use powdered soap because powdered soap can sit on the fabric and can bleach it, even if it's a delicate fabric or a delicate soap. I have ruined quilts with powdered soap sitting and bleaching. So I use a liquid soap, cool water, and then I dry my fabrics very damply. And when I press them, that's when I use starch. I have a video tutorial on that as well, but I try to press it when it's damp. So I do that, but I don't, like I said, I don't pre-wash pre-cuts. If I've made a quilt made of pre-cuts, I will absolutely use color catchers when the quilt is done to catch that excess dye. In fact, whenever I'm done washing a quilt, I always use color catchers. So yeah, when in doubt, I try to pre-wash as much as possible. Now I know some people will even pre-wash their pre-cuts, but then like I said, then they shrivel up out of shape. I've just had too many issues with it. So for me, it's better safe than sorry. Okay, I'll check your comments again. Okay, good. Just making sure I'm caught up with everybody. Erin wants to know, can you use an old blanket instead of batting? The answer to that is, why don't you try it and see what happens? I don't like to say absolutely yes, absolutely no. I like to say, this is what I do. This is what I try. It's all an experiment. Try it out and see what happens. I know that that's in the olden days, they certainly did that. Kind of related to that, another myth people like to say is like, oh, you should never use the sheet for quilting. Well, when I was first starting and I couldn't really afford nice quality fabric, I did go to the store and I did use sheets for the backs of my quilts, and I didn't have any issues with them. So really, again, it's personal preference. If you're using an old blanket inside the middle, you don't know what's inside of that quilt, so you might want to launder it really well. It's going to be a lot thicker, so you definitely would not want to hand quilt it. But again, the answer is try and experiment and see. Test things out. Make a quilt that you're just experimenting with, and then you can learn a lot of things each time. For me, I prefer to use batting, natural fiber batting. I prefer to use fabric for the back of my quilt. I prefer to piece my backings because I like to use up a lot of scraps on my backings. But these are things that have happened over time as I've experimented and figured out what I like. Again, no right or wrong answer when it comes to a lot of this stuff. Okay, KP wants to know, always start quilting in the middle and work your way to one side or edge, then rotate it 180 degrees and go back to the center and work it out. Yes, I say that a lot. She says, I know you like to do that for one side, but that goes against what I've heard many, many times. So yes, in fact, I have, when I teach in person, I do kind of like a video, how do I quilt it? And I show lots of different examples. So basically, in a nutshell, like with this quilt on the wall, I don't start quilting in the middle. I start on one side and I do one pass across the quilt. So like if I'm doing straight lines in the ditch, I do all of those maybe like 8 to 10 inches apart. Then I do another pass. Then I do another pass, and I do another pass, no matter what my quilting design is. It might be straight lines, it might be wavy lines, it might be custom quilting. And so I'm always working from one side to the middle. When I get to the middle, I scrunch up the quilt, I rotate it, and I keep from the middle, and I keep going out. Now, I've experimented both ways, and again, there's no right or wrong way. If you have basted your quilt really well, you can start wherever you want. The myth of why you have to start in the middle is because they're worried about if you don't start in the middle, you'll scoot your fabric over and you'll get everything out of whack. But with spray basting, that's really not an issue. And as you're making these passes across the quilt, once you've made one pass across the quilt, you've anchored it and it's not going anywhere. The number one reason why I like to work my way from right to left across the quilt is that it's easier to manipulate under the machine. And here's why. Kind of think of this in your mind. If you have this big old quilt and you shove it under your machine and you have half the quilt under your machine, you are already stressed out because you're like, how the heck am I going to quilt this puppy? However, if you start and you only have a little tiny bit of the quilt under your machine, then you can quilt that, because you only have, like if you start, let's see, if you start on one side, you only have maybe 4 or 5 inches under the quilt. Then you scrunch it up, and now maybe you've got 10 inches. Then you scrunch it up, and then you've got 15. Then you scrunch it up, and then you have 20 inches. And let's say it's an 80-inch wide quilt, so you go 5, 10, 15, 20, all the way to 40 for an 80-inch wide quilt. You get to 40 inches scrunched under the machine. You've already quilted your way, and you're halfway across the quilt, and you're like, I can do that. That's not so hard. Then when you rotate it, again, you only have 40 inches. Then it's 35 and 30 and 25, or 10 inches and 20 inches and 30 and 40, meaning however much you scrunch under the quilt. So if you start on the side, it's like that analogy of the pot or the frog in the boiling water. Now, I do not recommend this at all, and I do not recommend cruelty to animals. It's just a tongue-in-cheek thing. How do you boil a frog? You don't throw it in a pot of boiling water. It's going to jump out. Instead, you put the frog in the water and you turn it up 5 degrees, and you turn it up and you turn it up, and all of a sudden you boil the frogs. I hope that's not how they do frogs' legs. I don't know. That's not a thing that I eat. It seems kind of cruel to me. But the analogy is, you don't shove yourself in the middle of a quilt and panic and want to get out of hot water. You work your way slowly across the quilt, scrunching and smushing a little bit at a time. If you guys go and look at some of my YouTube videos, I'm starting to share more and more videos of how I do it. And when we do the Modern Logs quilt along, heads up, in September, I actually have filmed a lot of myself scrunching and smushing the quilt. So just keep watching me on Facebook, my blog, my YouTube channel, and you guys will get a chance to actually see how I do that and see how I go across the quilt. So again, that's a long answer to your short question, but try it in the middle, try it on the side, see whatever works for you. If you go back to my blog and just scroll through, you'll also see some still shots of me kind of scrunching and smushing the quilt under the machine. So I hope that helps. All right, we've got about 5 or 6 more questions here to answer, and then I think we're done for today, and then we'll have our giveaway. All right, good. I feel like everybody's kind of sticking around, so I'm glad you're enjoying this. Connie wants to know, press your seams open, press to the dark side, which one? I've mentioned before, I press my seams open. You absolutely do not have to do that. You want to know the number one reason why I press my seams open? Okay, I'll give you the textbook answer, and then I'll give you the honest answer. They're both true. The textbook answer is it makes your seams flat. It's easier to stitch. You don't have bumps in your quilt. It's easier to base. Pressing all the seams open in your quilt is a dream because the whole quilt lies flat. I press 100% of my seams open on 100% of the quilts I do. I started doing that 5 years ago. I love it, and I would never do it any other way. That's the textbook answer. The real answer for why I do it is because then I don't have to worry about which way to flip my seams. It is so much easier. I do use pins, and I pin generously, but I don't have to think about it. And those of you that know me, I'm a minimalist. I don't like to think. I just like to do. So if I know I press seams open every single block, every single time, and I pin generously, I never have to think about which way to rotate the block. Saying all that, you absolutely have my permission, my blessing, my thanks. If you want to press your seams to the dark side, you press your seams to the dark side. If you like it and it works for you and you don't want to think about a new method, absolutely press it however you want. The other thing with pressing seams open is it helps prevent shadowing, because sometimes you can't necessarily press to the dark if your seams are going a different way. So sometimes you might have to clip a seam, or you might have to open up your seams. If you press your seams open, you never have to worry about those issues. So, oh, Heidi, first time watching. Hey, good to see you. Shiloh, nice to see you. Janice, good. I'm glad it makes sense. The one thing I will address, because I know somebody down here on my page asks this, but what about cutting your thread? If you press seams open and you stitch in the ditch, aren't you cutting your thread? Absolutely not. You're not. I'm stitching in the ditch, so I've got a seam going this way because I've stitched, let's say I've stitched my piecing, and then I'm stitching in the ditch this way. I am not cutting threads. Even if the seam is like this and I'm going this way, I'm not cutting thread. If you're worried about cutting thread, that would happen anytime you have an intersection. And we know that every time you sew a seam, you're going to sew a seam one way, you're going to sew a seam another way. It's going to lock it. You have intersections all over your quilts where you're stitching one way and you're stitching the other way, and it does not come apart. You do need to shorten your stitch length, and you do need to be very careful and not not give a lot of wear and tear in your quilt. But it's in my experience, I have been pressing seams open for 5 years on all my quilts. I've been stitching in the ditch with seams pressed open for 5 years, and none of those quilts has come apart. I haven't ever had an issue with any of that. Okay, so just it's okay, it's okay. One of the things I do like to say, it's kind of funny, and it's totally fine. One of the reasons, or one of the places that these myths come from, is they come from well-known designers or quilting instructors who don't necessarily make their own quilts. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this, but think about, when's the last time you purchased a pattern, or you took a class, or you watched a video from someone who actually makes their own quilt from start to finish? Most designers, and again, nothing wrong with this. This is the industry standard. Here's like some behind the scenes. Most designers, they design. They don't sew their quilts. They don't quilt their quilts, and that's okay. They design their quilts, and they're wonderful designers, and they're wonderful with math. Maybe they sew their top, but most designers are so busy designing, they employ stunt sewers, and they have people sew for them. And so they have these amazing meticulous sewers. They sew, they follow all the rules. It's great. If a designer sews their quilt top, they 99% of the time they're not going to quilt it themselves. They're going to send it off to be long arm quilted, because again, they're so busy designing. Again, nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Me, little Krista here, I love piecing my own quilts, quilting my own quilts, basting my own quilts. So I'm one of the few designers that makes 100% of my quilts 100% of the time. And the reason I do that is so that I can authoritatively tell you, I have made 100 quilts in the last few years. I have pieced 100 quilts. I have quilted 100 quilts. In 100 quilts, I have not had issues. So anyway, that's why I'm not trying to knock anyone down or anything like that. Do what works for you, but just understand that people that are telling you, don't press your seams open, don't do this, don't do that, start in the middle of your quilt. Are they actually quilting their own quilts? Are they piecing their own quilts? Are they quilting? Or is it just information that they are passing down from generation to generation? So just look where the information's coming from, test it out yourself, and realize that you're the boss of your own quilt. So when it comes to experimenting, try these different methods, and if they work for you. I also will tell you this, if you try my methods and you're like, Krista, you don't know what you're talking about. I am not gonna press my seams open. I am not gonna spray base. I'm not gonna do this. That's awesome. We will still be friends, and I will be proud of you for giving it a try. What I always like to say when I'm teaching machine quilting is, if you come into my class and at the end of the day you decide, you know what, I am not a machine quilter, I will be like, thank you for trying. Thank you for trying and discovering what you like, because it's just as important to understand what you do like as what you don't like, and that's okay. Anyway, that's just a little soapbox for you. Do what you like, try it all out. No right or wrong way to do things. There's only your way, and when you find your way and you have a great time, I'm happy I can be a part of that. Okay, get off my soapbox there. Katie says, I was told my long strips were wavy because I ironed my seams open. No, that doesn't cause wavy strips. What can cause wavy strips is if you put too much pressure on your iron, or like if you use steam or something. However, that gets to another issue. I don't like to use long strips. Like, I know strip piecing is super popular, but like for most of my quilts, when you'll see them, I don't do very much strip piecing, because when you're strip piecing, it can be faster, but it slows you down in the end. What happens with long strips of fabric is when you sew them together, you can ease in extra fabric. So let's say, for example, you have a strip of fabric that's 40 inches, and you're supposed to sew two pieces together, and you're supposed to cut them off at 10 inches. So you're supposed to have this piece that's like 10 inches wide by 5 inches wide. You have 2.5 inch strips. Rather than sewing lots of long strips and cutting them apart at 10 inches, I would rather cut out all the 10-inch pieces and then sew them together. Because if you cut pieces of fabric at 10 inches, you know they're 10 inches. If you sew strips together and then you cut them, that's where you get the waviness, because some of the strips, maybe one of the strips is 10 inches, but the other one is like 10 1/16 or 9 7/8. So that's where you're gonna get those inconsistencies. In other words, if you sew first and then cut, you're building in inconsistency. If you cut first and then sew, you're gonna get more accurate results. If you didn't get any of what I just said, don't worry about it. Keep doing what you're doing. That's kind of a little higher level thinking there. But when you see my patterns and I have you cut like 100 squares, and I have you sew them after you cut them, and you're like, why didn't Krista strip piece this? That's the reason why. If you cut everything out first, it'll be more accurate if you cut first and then sew. So there you go. Man, I'm on my soapbox today. I've missed you guys. Okay, Lisa says, I want a job piecing quilts for someone else. Yes, and that, going back to what I just said, you can actually have a job. Lots of designers want people to piece for them, and they'll pay you for it. So if you just kind of get your little feelers out there, that is a real job, and you can actually do that. And a lot of designers do that, and they love you for it. So I think that's super cool. Okay, Kyle says, when pressing seams open on optical illusion, the 1/4 inch seams lined up on the 1 inch strips, that was a visual to tell if my 1/4 inch seams were correct. If they were, it was visually correct. If they weren't, you could tell right away. That is a great tip, Kyle. Thank you for sharing that. Oh, Pam's like, I want that job too. I want that job too. A lot of times, some of the designers that you follow, they'll ask for pattern testers. That's a really good way to get in the door to see if they want to try you out and become a stunt sewer. Some of them will pay you. Some of them will pay you in fabric. You know, different designers do different things. But keep an eye out on your favorite designers. And a lot of times they'll say, hey, I'm looking for pattern testers. I'm looking for stuff. They'll give you free fabric and free patterns, and that's absolutely a fun way to get involved with some of your favorite designers. Oh, Jessica said you took my class and it gave you confidence, and and it also told you where your limit was. Excellent. I'm so happy to hear that, Jessica. Oh yeah, try your local quilt shop. They can have sample sewers. Yes, you can definitely sew for your local quilt shops as well. Valine says local shops want people to make the demo quilts and they'll pay you. Yeah, I used to do that for one of my local shops, and they would pay me, and then at the end of the time, like they would pay me in fabric credit. So like I would get to shop at the store based on how much sewing I did for them, and then like maybe 6 months to a year after they were done with the sample, then I got to keep the sample. So it was like a win-win all the way around. Lisa's, yeah, we'll work for fabric, right? All right, a couple more questions, and then we're just about to our hour. Let's see. Oh, Violet wants to know, I love the topic about pressing seams, which we've covered. I heard so many opinions about ironing seams open or to the dark. So yeah, we've covered that in depth. That kind of brings up another question about steaming. I don't steam. I don't put water in my iron because we have really bad water here in Las Vegas. So if I ever have to get a quilt wet, I will just use a squirt bottle, and I will squirt my quilt rather than steaming it. And that seems to work just as well. Okay, Doris wants to know, stitching in the ditch means in the seam line or next to it? The answer is yes. The idea, technically, you're supposed to get right there in the middle of that ditch, but if you're a little bit off to one side or the other, totally fine. You're not going to notice it once you're further away. So aim for the middle. If you're off, not a big deal at all. All right, 3 more questions. Anne says, in her first ever quilting class, we were told not to use fabrics with lines, bars, or columns in them. This was in the 1970s. Yeah, just like I think last week someone said, oh, my teacher said never use orange fabric. And then I showed her a picture of like all my orange fabrics. So there's definitely all these myths that we don't have to worry about. My kind of rule of thumb is when I'm using printed fabrics that have a definite direction on them, I don't stress at all about trying to line it up. I let it be whimsical and interesting, and it adds to the charm. All right, Valine said, I've been told I can only use a certain kind of thread, also that bias binding will last longer. So we've covered that. Yeah, you can use whatever thread you want. I just think cotton is a better quality, and I like the straight grain binding. We talked about steam and starting in the middle. And then Barb, this is the last question. Barb says, some people say you can sell quilts. Oh, this is a very good question. We're going to just touch on this briefly. Some people say you can sell quilts made with copyright fabric or patterns, and others say you cannot. Disney comes to mind. Is there a surefire way to know if you can or cannot do this? Please put this myth to the test. We could talk for hours on copyright. I will refer you guys to a wonderful Facebook group called Just Wanna Quilt. It is a research project from Tulane University, managed and hosted by Dr. Elizabeth Townsend Gard, who's become a very good friend of mine. She has a podcast, so just go look up Just Wanna Quilt. They will talk to you for hours and hours and pages on copyright. Suffice it to say, if it's someone else's work and it has a copyright on it, or it's a pattern that you buy and the designer has said, please do not sell quilts made of my fabric, respect their wishes. Now, I'm pretty open-minded when it comes to stuff. If people want to buy my patterns and sell and make, and they want to make a quilt from it, I don't mind, but that's me as a designer. But you certainly can't sell the pattern because it's my pattern unless you're like reselling it at a garage sale or something. Some licensed fabrics, you are not allowed to make things commercially and sell them, like Disney, Star Wars, and stuff like that. A lot of it just depends on how much the company's going to go after you. When in doubt, try to look up the company's website and see what they say. Some will give you blanket permission, others will not. It's a big mess out there. But when in doubt, if you're using a fabric for commercial or for personal use, this is where you get into trouble. It's for commercial use when you're trying to sell stuff. If you're using it for personal use, it's totally fine. Normally, the designer will give you the permission, or they'll have it stated if they're going to. So let me be very clear on this. If a designer is okay with you using their items to sell, they will normally say that in the pattern, in the fabric, on their website. If you're not sure, ask them. That's the main thing. Ask them, and if they say no, respect their wishes. Don't trust what you read on the internet. Don't trust somebody, well, somebody so-and-so said this. Kind of use a lot of common sense. You know, if you're making, for example, if you're making a quilt with black and white fabric and it's like a log cabin black and white quilt, that's probably not an issue. But if you're, you know, if you're copying, like let's say you're copying this bling design and you're making like an outfit out of it and you're going to sell like custom couture, you know, outfits, probably that's a violation. But again, if you were to go and ask me and you talk to me about what you're doing, I would probably say yes. A lot of designers are going to say yes, they're going to let you do it, but you do need to ask. So that's about all I'm going to say on that. Go to Just Want to Quilt. They've got books out, they've got lectures, they've got podcasts, lots of really great information. Oh, and Lisa says, as a music teacher, I have my yearly lesson on copyright. It's so important. Yes, copyright is very, very important. I'm not a copyright expert. I try to be very, very careful on what I do. So we're just at the end of our hour. So I want to end with, I'm going to take these pieces of paper. So one lucky person, I had 3 sheets of questions. I'm going to mix them up. I'm going to point to one. One lucky person is going to win. And remember, all of my books are still on sale. They're only $19.95. I have 3 books out. They retail from $25 to $30. They're only $19.95. So one person is going to win this one. And the lucky winner is Doris Kelly, right here. I pointed to her name. This was totally random. She actually had a star. Doris Kelly, I know you've bought some stuff for me before. Message me, let me know you got this, and I will send you a copy. And if you already have this, you can pass it on to a friend as a gift or something and to get them quilting. So I just want to end by saying thank you guys for being here. Thanks for watching the chat. Grab your bling pattern if you haven't already. For those of you that want to make it, I still have 2 kits left of this right here on my wall. I have 2 kits in the black, and I think I have about 4 kits with the white background. I also have the fat quarters that you can get, or of course you can use anything you want. You don't have to buy my fabric, you just have to buy my pattern and join me for Bling Quilts Along. So I will go back through, I will see and answer any questions that I miss, and until next week, we'll meet next week, next Tuesday, 3 p.m. Pacific time, and I hope you guys have a great day. Ta-ta for now.